Hey, welcome into the GPS podcast. I'm your host, Garrett Spriggs, and I'm here to help us grow past Sunday with my co-host, Pastor Doug Spriggs.
I like that I get to be called a co-host. It makes me feel like I'm somebody.
Yeah, it makes us equals, which in most of this job I'm not, so I kind of have to take advantage of
I
it.
could only dream of one day being your equal.
Yeah, well, keep dreaming, and maybe we'll get there. We last week left off with some questions that were covered because of our Worldview class. So we're talking about biblical worldview that we're doing at Grace Fellowship, and we had some great questions arise because of it. We've been asking people to send in more questions based off these classes and just general Christian worldview questions. So if you're curious as to what Christian worldview is, kind of what the basis of that is, I just encourage you to go listen to last week's episode. Pastor Doug gives us some definitions to go by off there, and we had some really fun, interesting conversations. So this week we have some more questions that were sent in and some other things to jump off of from those questions. And so I thought we'd just get right into it and start asking you the hard stuff. So Pastor Doug, you ready for these hard questions?
I didn't do that well in the SAT. Are these those kind of questions?
These I'm pretty sure these were on the SAT. So maybe you'll remember, what you got wrong.
When I took the SAT, it was 1926. So I don't know if anything's changed since then.
I think it was only like out of 10 back then, right?
That's right. There was only 10 things to know.
Yeah, exactly. Well, let's start you off here and see if you can help the people get some answers to these questions. So first question we have is a great question, and it's been asked in a lot of different ways, but here's one example of how it's asked. It is, how do we reconcile the value of mankind as made in the image of God and the destruction of people groups in the Bible, for instance, the Canaanites? So in the Worldview class, we talked a lot about how men are made in the image of God, men and women. I say men as the general term for humanity, in the image of God, and so they have intrinsic value. And yet, we also see in the Bible a couple times where God tells his people, go wipe out these people who are made in the image of God, from what we understand. So how do we justify that is really the root of that question.
Yeah, and it's more than just a couple times.
Yep.
There's a bunch of times.
Yeah.
There are times when God directly wipes out large groups of people. There are times when God commands the armies of Israel to go and do that. And it's unsettling. And the truth of the matter is there are some topics, some questions that come up where the logical, rational explanation is rather simple and straightforward. But the emotional side of it is really hard to grapple with. And this is one of those. There's a fairly straightforward theological, philosophical track to take to go, okay, does it make sense that this loving God who creates people in his own image would also wipe them out? And that's basically the question. And there's a logical answer to that, and I'll get into that in a second. But I also want to recognize the fact that it doesn't make me comfortable. And I don't think it should make any of us comfortable. And I think the fact that it doesn't make us comfortable is further evidence that we're made in the image of God. But let's just break it down and think about this theoretically for a second, because a lot of this is very similar to the question of why is there evil in the world? Why, if God is so good, do bad things happen to good people and so forth? So the question is, why would God kill or ordain the killing of large groups of people in some case? Like in the case of the Canaanites brought up in the question, it's like you go into Jericho, you don't leave anybody, man, woman, child, you wipe them all out. And we look at that and go, wow, that seems like a little extreme, right?
Yeah.
But the truth of the matter is, instead of asking the question, why does God ordain the killing of some people? Maybe if we get our worldview straight, we would ask the question, wow, how is it that God doesn't just kill us all?
Yeah.
Because the truth of the matter is that the scripture says very clearly, beginning to end, it teaches this, but it summarizes this very clearly in the book of Romans. Romans 3:23, it says, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. In other words, everybody's guilty. There is no one not guilty before a holy God. In Romans 6:23, it says the wages of sin is death, destruction, condemnation, damnation. So it's not just that people are killed, it's their eternal destiny that should really shake our hearts, right? And so the truth of the matter is all have sinned, and the wages of sin is death. God told Adam and Eve this at the beginning. It's been reiterated and illustrated for us throughout all of time. And we know that sin separates us from God, and the penalty of that is condemnation. And so, really, we should be blown away that God is so patient and so gracious and so kind that he doesn't go ahead and just wipe us all out. So that to me makes rational sense.
Sure.
The truth of the matter is that he does allow us to live, and we need to remember that because of who God is, because of his worthiness to be worshipped, it is a massive, massive crime to disobey him, disrespect him, worship other gods, ignore him. We don't think of it that way, but it is. It's the ultimate crime. And so there is death in the case of that. But I want to sort of take us through a little bit of a scriptural journey here.
So before you dive into there, just to clarify a bit, are you inferring that essentially it could be a just penalty is what is happening in a lot of these circumstances?
Well, the truth is, again, we stop with our hearts. We go, wait a minute, men, women, and children, civilians, like what? How is that right? The reason that it bothers our hearts is because we accept the genuine idea that people have human rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? If you take that away, it seems awful. But that's if you or I take it away. But if the God of the universe takes it away, he is the only one who gives life, and he is the only one ultimately who takes life away. So he has the right. All of his judgments are just. All of his reasoning is sound. So he doesn't explain himself to us, nor does he have to. But the truth of the matter is, whenever he does whatever he does, it is the just and appropriate thing to do.
Yeah.
So justice is really at the heart of this. Now, it's really not that complicated an answer when we break it down that way. The creator of the universe is the author of life, and he alone possesses the authority to give it and take it away. And there's just countless biblical verses to back that up. But aside from all of that, it's reasonable. If there is, in fact, a creator God, and if he is the giver of life, and if life only exists through him, by him, and because of him, then he is the one who has control over that. That's why he tells us not to shed human blood.
Yeah.
But he has a right to do so.
I think that brings up a reason why maybe this question is often asked or a struggle for us is, we can get behind that probably, theoretically, but why then did he send his people to go carry out this thing? Why not just snap them dead? Don't have to put bloodshed on, responsibility on these people's hands or, anything like that. Like, there's something to the human element of, okay, now we have to go and wipe out these people. That makes it kind of like, why would God do that if he is loving and all that stuff, right? Which I know is what you're kind of getting to.
Yeah, you're alluding to like just the emotional impact on the people who have to carry out.
Yeah, it seems so unnecessary, right? I mean, I think that's where a lot of people come to the grappling with this question. It's like, this is why God shows mercy and redemption and all this in other areas. Why not, or at least give them a chance or something like that, instead of just use us to wipe them out and put that pressure on us? I say us as in God's people.
Yeah. So there's two aspects to what you're asking about. One is this: how is it? Why use people to do this? Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, we have to understand this is an act of war, and so this is a military campaign. And again, why are there wars? Because of sin. Sin is the problem. Sin is the problem, and everyone is guilty of sin. Because of sin, we live in a broken world. And and you refer to God having mercy, and you say, well, why not just have more mercy, give people more chances? Again, number one, he's God. He's all knowing, he's all loving, and he's just. So he's always right in what he does, even when he doesn't explain it to us and we don't know the details of what goes into those decisions. But secondly, we have to realize that because he's just, every one of those decisions is right. And that's why I'm always stressing the fact that we have a tendency to look at circumstances and judge God in light of those circumstances. We're always wrong when we do that. We have to look at who God is and judge circumstances in light of who God is. So whatever else may be true, it would be an act of pure evil if you or I did that. Because we do not have that authority, we do not have that wisdom, we do not have that understanding. That's why when Stalin goes in and wipes out millions of people, that is a catastrophic sin. When God does it, it is not, because God is the only one who has actually been sinned against. He's the only one who has the right to exact that punishment. And by the way, we're thinking in terms of temporary things more than eternal things when we get caught up in this. Remember, people who die without Christ spend eternity damned to hell, which again, I don't like. I don't like to think about it. I don't like to talk about it. I don't want it to happen to anybody. But the truth of the matter is, it does happen, and it's by the choice of people to rebel against God. So whenever God exacts that punishment, he is doing something that is just. And the fact that he carries it out in someone's life before they would have died of natural causes, when you consider the breadth of eternity, is a very, very minor difference.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's one of the things we often don't consider. We tend to think like, oh, even the women and children and those innocent and like the people who really probably had nothing to do with this, maybe they even loved God or whatever, and they were caught up in this area, or maybe they just weren't introduced to God in the way, whatever. And those are legitimate feelings. You feel bad for people in those situations. And I think God gave us these hearts and compassion, right? And he's the one who is love. So the fact that we think, oh no, their life is over, woe is they, it is a sad thing, and it's something that should be heavily contemplated about. But also, don't forget the fact that they are under the just ruling of a loving and just God. So I don't even want to say, oh, maybe they go to heaven or whatever. Maybe. I don't know. The fact is, I'm not God. I don't get to decide it, and neither does anybody else except for God, the one who decided to make these things happen. So we can trust in him that, you know what, it doesn't seem fair to us from our perspective, but it's fair. Whatever he determines is fair, and even if that is something we don't really understand, why did they get this treatment and we didn't? God's got reasons, and he's the one who sees it all and knows it all. And the good news is he is love. So we get to trust that he makes these decisions out of love. Yes. He doesn't just sacrifice love for getting revenge on these people who did something. No, he's still doing this out of love.
And it's reasonable that that's hard for us to fully wrap our minds around, because our minds are finite and God is infinite. I want to read a passage though here that I find helpful in this. This is the very thing that the question is referring to. When they're going into the promised land and God says, I want you to wipe out the people of Canaan, right? This is Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 3. Know therefore today that it is the Lord your God who is crossing over before you as a consuming fire. He will destroy them, and he will subdue them before you, so that you may drive them out and destroy them quickly, just as the Lord has spoken to you. Do not say in your heart, when the Lord your God has driven them out before you, because of my righteousness the Lord has brought me into to possess this land. But it is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is dispossessing them before you. It is not for your righteousness or for the uprightness of your heart that you're going to possess the land, but it is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord your God is driving them out before you, in order to confirm the oath which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So God says, it's not just I'm being nice to you as Israelites and giving you this land and
'Cause
these
you
people are in
deserved
the
it.
way. No, he's saying these people are wicked. They're sinning against me, and the appropriate punishment is what I am bringing to them.
It seems so apropos for today's world, whether you're thinking Middle East, America, like that we have a thought in our minds as people who follow God, I think. Sometimes that like, no, God's got me. God's taking care of me. Yeah, ultimately he's going to work it out for my good. And that includes where I live and my country and my freedom and all this stuff. And yet that we see that God doesn't operate that kind of way.
Right.
It's more the opposite. We see more often where he takes away what he has given to people because of how they have acted with it.
Yeah, and that's why God also warned his people when he sent them into the promised land. He goes, listen, don't start doing what they were doing. Don't put yourself in the same shoes that they were in. And you look at how God has to judge Israel numerous times. And yet God has made a promise that he is going to ultimately save his people. So, you know, it's not easy for me to grapple with this. I struggle with it on an emotional level, but on an intellectual level, it makes perfect sense to me. If God is who he says he is, he has the right to tell us these are the rules, and he equips us to live according to those rules. And when we ignore him and choose to be our own gods, there is a cost to that, and he tells us up front what that cost is, and still we choose that. Ultimately, that this is the thing. People say, how could a loving God send people to hell? And I think there's a way to look at it where you say God doesn't send anybody to hell. We're already bound for hell because of our choices. God sends a Savior and gives us the opportunity to be saved by his mercy and grace. So we're kind of looking at it backwards. We're going, well, we're not that bad. How come God's so mean? It's exactly the opposite. He is showing unbelievable kindness by extending mercy to some.
You know, one of the other big topics of this last worldview class that we talked about was the fact that God is the creator of the universe. And you gave a lot of great reasons and evidence as to why we can reasonably believe that. But I want to give you a little more chance to maybe dive into that here. So aside from the fact that just the Bible says so, is it reasonable, like actually scientifically reasonable, for us to believe that the universe was created by God? And if so, do you have any more evidence maybe we can help people think through?
Yeah, I like the way you asked the question because the debate is not about the Bible versus science. The issue is about following the scientific evidence wherever it leads. And as we've been talking about in the Worldview class, one of the mistakes that is made, commonly, especially in our culture today, is that there's already some presuppositions put in place before we begin to look at the evidence. If there's a presupposition that there is no God, or at least that we could never possibly know, and therefore it's outside of our realm to study to understand whether there's God, if that's our presupposition, we're never, ever going to be able to follow the evidence where it leads. All that I'm arguing for is that we ought to follow the evidence wherever it leads. And because if we don't, if we start with that presupposition, we're only left with crazy guesses when we come to these places that obviously point to a designer and a creator. So the argument we've been making is that in addition to the fact that the Bible says it's true, let's say for the sake of discussion there was no Bible. Let's say for the sake of discussion God never told us he existed. And we just had to start from scratch and go, what does the evidence seem to show? My argument is the evidence clearly leads the rational mind to a place that says there must be some sort of creator. There must be some sort of designer. And then the question becomes, okay, well, what do we do about that? How do we know him? What does he expect of us? Those questions follow. So I touched on a couple things in the class. I'd like to maybe expand a little more in this context. One of the biggest things that we have to understand, and again, I'm arguing from science here, is what scientists call the anthropic principle. The anthropic principle basically says that the physical structure of the whole universe is exactly what it must be in order to sustain human life. And from the most microscopic atom to the vastness of the whole universe, the evidence is that it is exactly as it must be against enormous, infinitesimal odds. It is exactly what it must be in order for it to sustain human life. And this is not a Christian argument. This is a scientific argument. But probably the most famous atheistic scientist of our time is a guy by the name of Stephen Hawking. He's absolutely brilliant, genius, a great scientific mind. He wrote his most famous book is called A Brief History of Time. I want to give you a quote. This is Stephen Hawking. This is what he says. He says, if the rate of expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller by even 1 part in 100,000 million, it would have recollapsed before it reached its present size. On the other hand, if it had been greater by a part in a million, the universe would have expanded too rapidly for stars and planets to form. That's what Stephen Hawking says.
Yeah, and you might be listening to this if you weren't at the class and be like, wait a second, the Big Bang didn't happen, I'm Christian. But let's real quick attack that. The Big Bang does not discredit the Bible and the God of the Bible from creating things as he created them.
No, in fact, the Big Bang Theory fully supports a biblical view of creation, which is that the universe began to exist at a moment in time.
Yeah.
And beyond that, we're having to make guesses at how exactly that
we don't know exactly how that is. We can look with science from what we do understand, and it points to certain things. And who knows, in 200 years, we might be like, well, that was foolish. But either way, it doesn't discredit that the God of the universe could have created.
And when I was a kid and the Big Bang Theory was a new idea, most religious folks were like, no, that's science. That's not how the Bible says. Actually, what the Bible says is completely consistent with the Big Bang. Mm-hmm. It is to say that there was a time when the universe did not exist, and then it sprung into existence in a moment. And when that happened, the Bible says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It just tells it in that much detail. Mm-hmm. But it's universally accepted now by scientists who are religious or atheistic that
there was a start.
The Big Bang, there's a start to things, which is really important. It means that the universe began to exist. The argument before that was that the universe is eternal. Mm-hmm. But now we know that the universe began to exist.
Because of even just as simply as the fact of everything in the universe is moving. If you trace it backwards, it would have all
it's expanding. It's not just moving; it's expanding as a whole.
So it couldn't have been eternal based off all the evidence.
That's right. So nobody's arguing that anymore. It began to exist, and here's the philosophical statement that matters there: whatever begins to exist must have a source. Mm-hmm. That means the source must have been outside of the universe itself. So the universe couldn't have created itself. God could not be part of the universe. God is outside of the universe. There must be an all-powerful or an extremely powerful and extremely intelligent being who could do this. And even according to Hawking, that had to be done at such a rate that even the slightest, and I mean slightest, what did he say? 1 part in 1,000 million? That's really high odds. That in order for that to happen, if it had been off by in one tiniest degree, then the universe would not exist. We're not just saying human life would not exist. We're saying the universe would not exist.
And I believe Stephen Hawking is one of the leaders in this, but there are many who think then, if that's the case, that means the multi-universe theory of there's billions and billions and billions and billions of essentially attempts at it, and we're on the lucky one that worked. I think we can all be reasonable adults and say that takes so much more faith to believe that's the case that we're in than it would take to even believe that there's a God who's outside of that universe.
And again, in science, any reasonable hypothesis is worth considering, but it has to have some evidence for it to be a reasonable hypothesis. There is not a shred of evidence for multi-universe
the
theory.
biggest evidence is we don't know what else it could have been.
Right.
Nothing else seems to explain it.
And nowadays, all kidding aside, culturally, it's become a really popular thing to think about a multiverse. It's in movies, it's in comic books, it's in discussions. And so this idea, which we look at and we watch a Marvel movie and we go, oh, that's science fiction. But the science fiction is based on this idea. And this idea does not have a shred of scientific evidence. It's just that the evidence is so overwhelming that there must be an intelligent creator. But since we've decided as scientists before we started that we can't end up there, we have to come up with something else. And that's the argument that is often offered now.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense to me. And the argument now I hear countering that is, well, you're just proving the point then, because that means something else created it, where then did that something else come from? Yes. Right? So what's your answer to that?
Again, whatever begins to exist must have had a source or a creator. The scripture is very clear about this, and it's interesting that we can now make our hypothesis based on the evidence. And then when we check it against the Bible, we go, how interesting, the Bible actually says it happened that way. It's not the other way around.
Yeah.
So what am I talking about? I'm talking about the fact that the Bible teaches that there are two things in existence, two categories of things. There is God and there is not God. Everything that is not God is created by God. And God exists in and of himself. He's the only being, thing, or idea even that is eternal. And the word eternal means without beginning and without end.
Do you have any biblical evidence we can look to point to that concept?
Sure. First of all, the first sentence of the Bible, in the beginning, God, right? And then the beginning of the book of John also, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And it talks about how he spoke everything into existence. In Colossians, I don't have the verse in front of me. I want to say it's...
Just read all Colossians.
Yeah.
You'll
in
find
Colossians, it says that... He created all things, and all things were created by him and for him. And he holds all things together. So the biblical argument has always been that God is eternal. He was and is to come. When Moses asks him for a name, he says, my name is I am. I am. He uses the present tense to even name himself. In other words, not I was, not I will one day be. He is unchanging. He has always been. The Bible presents him as what we call immutable, which means incapable of change, which means he's not growing older, he's not getting better, he's not getting worse, he's not learning, he's not forgetting. He doesn't change. So that's the biblical argument in a nutshell. So when we consider the theory, we go, does it make sense that if, in fact, let's just say if, the biblical view is correct and everything is two, not everything is one, then it all lines up and we go, yeah, this actually makes perfect sense. But if everything is one, if the cosmos is all there is, was, or ever will be, which was Carl Sagan's famous quote, if that's the case, then there cannot be anything or anyone outside of the cosmos. And if there is no one outside of the cosmos, there cannot be one who starts the creation process. Whatever begins to exist must have a creator. That creator must be outside of that which he creates. He cannot create himself. So it's practical logic, and it makes perfect sense.
I heard a comedian the other day talking about just basically is like, it takes a lot of people think it takes so much faith to believe in a God, because how the heck do you explain, God? Like, that's just a hard concept to grasp. And yet, it's much harder to say, well, I believe that nothing created the universe, because we know nothing doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
So that's a lot harder to really grasp.
Yeah. Yeah. So you can either believe in God or you can believe in nothing.
Yeah.
And nothing does not, and again, this is simply a scientific statement to say that there is no evidence in all of our study to determine that something ever comes from nothing.
So to believe that
it's a law of
everything
nature.
came from nothing is
That's
a bit
right.
of a stretch.
It's a bit of a stretch.
Yeah, to put it
And
politely.
then to add to that life comes from non-life. Also, we've been trying it in test tubes. There's been, back in the 80s and 90s, there was a bunch of like, big news. Somebody created some amino acids in a test tube, and it was like, see, that's the building blocks of life. We did this in a test tube. All of those tests have proven to be completely faulty because of the intricacies involved in it. The truth of the matter is, after all of the effort, there has never, ever, ever been a way to create life out of non-life. There's nothing in the history of the world to tell us that that's possible. And yet, we have to assume that if we assume there is not a God. So there must be an uncreated cause, an uncaused cause, an uncreated creator, somewhere in the process. If the law of cause and effect is true, then there must be an uncaused cause. The question is, who or what is that uncaused cause?
Yeah, and that's what we should be doing throughout our lives to investigate that, right?
That's right.
That's what has brought both of us to following God.
That's right.
Obviously,
because
the evidence.
If that uncaused cause is the God of the Bible, we better learn to know who he is. And if he's not, we better learn that too.
Probably more important in that
That's
sense,
right.
you know.
So the anthropic principle is huge. It says on a cellular level, the cells cannot exist the way that they do with such minute likelihood. The way that protons and electrons work together and hold everything together. All of this is at an atomic level. So if you take a microscope, and the lower we look at a microscope, the more obvious it is. And if you take a telescope and go further out, the more obvious it is. And then when you get into to living cells, and now we know about DNA. DNA is a complex language. Everyone, atheistic or not, who studies it knows that DNA is an extremely complex language, far more complex than the hard drive of your computer is able to hold. It is a language. There is no language that is ever created apart from, again, intelligence. The code of DNA tells our cells exactly what to do and how to do it, and no two are the same. It's an astonishing revelation. So again, the more that good science advances, the more obvious is the support for the biblical view of God. Now, just in the interest of time, let's leave the anthropic principle aside for a second. There's another really, really important issue here, and I didn't really get into this much at all in the class. It's the law of irreducible complexity. Again, we're talking about something that any scientist has already been introduced to in studies and understands. There's a law of irreducible complexity. Francis Schaeffer, he argued it this way. He had this great analogy. He said, what happens if a fish evolves lungs? What happens if a fish should happen to evolve lungs? Does it crawl out of the water and move up the evolutionary chart? No, it drowns, right?
Yeah.
That's what happens. So the law of irreducible complexity basically says that complex systems cannot develop piecemeal. They cannot develop one piece at a time. The complexity of a system is that everything depends upon everything else. And so, there's a million examples of this. You look at the way that a giraffe's neck is designed. The giraffe's neck is like nothing else. A giraffe is super tall with a very long neck, and it has to drink water. How does it drink water? It bends over and puts its head down for long periods of time to lap water up out of ponds or whatever, right? Well, if you or I did that, we would pass out because the blood rushes to your brain and your head fills with blood and you pass out. And if you fall in the water and you drown and die. There's no way for a giraffe to have evolved his long neck. That's one simple example. There's another animal there's a million of these in the animal world that fascinate me. There's a bug called the bombardier beetle. And I'm using very simple terms here to describe what a bombardier beetle is like. But the way a bombardier beetle protects itself is it has two chemicals inside its body in separate little chambers in its body. And when it gets close to a predator gets close to it, it spits both of those out at a precise angle. And when those two chemicals mix, it causes an explosion at the moment that they mix. Mm-hmm. So it has to wait till the predator gets close enough, and then it fires out these two sprays of chemicals, which do nothing to hurt the beetle while it's inside the beetle because they're kept separately. And then it mixes and blows up the scorpion or whatever it is that is about to kill it. Oh my goodness. How does that evolve over time? There's no way for it to have evolved the two chambers, and it couldn't have survived until it had them. It would have been eaten by the predators. So there's all of these examples of irreducible complexity. But when you really, really get down to it, you start looking at the cell. A human cell, a cell in a tree branch, any kind of living cell. Again, the complexity. Everything depends upon everything else in that cell. You can't develop it a little bit at a time. And now the best example of that, or a great example of that, is the human eye. The complexity of the human eye is out of this world. How any ophthalmologist ever gets his degree, I have no idea, because the complexity is so immense. It's not just about the physical lens and the iris and all of that kind of stuff. It's about the chemicals that get secreted at just the right moment and how the brain acts with the eye. The complexity of it is enormous. Everyone would have had to walk around blind for countless years and then that doesn't help you survive as a species, right? Yeah. There's not enough time for the eye to develop, even if you give it billions and billions and billions of years in order to be functional. It has to be made whole. So the irreducible complexity law tells us that, the most advanced factory with perfectly timed robots doing all of the work in the factory and everything working perfectly, and all of the computer technology that runs those robots is less complex than the inner workings of a single living cell. Mm-hmm. And it is impossible for something like that to arise out of sheer chance. It's not just unlikely. It's impossible. Yeah. You would never walk into a complex factory like that, like an Amazon, station, and walk in and go, "Oh wow, how cool that all this just came together like this." Yeah. Even if you give it billions of years, it's just a literal impossibility.
Well, and so that obviously what we're suggesting points to a creator, yes. And I don't want. This is a common thing. I think more so in years past, maybe it's developed some, but Christians, the word evolution gets real scary for Christians, mm-hmm. And clearly, based off what we were just talking about, that all of this points to a creator, not just billions of years of evolution. But don't be confused; there is such a thing as microevolution, and that exists and is measurable. And we're not saying that is not legitimate.
That simply means change over time, adaptation
within a system, yes, right? It's right. Not changing to a new system. It's a very different. You'll see birds going from one island to another and developing a different kind of beak or feeding on different things because of their environment. That stuff happens, but you don't see a bird going to a new island and becoming a monkey. And, right. We just have no evidence of any of that.
In fact, the evidence is completely to the contrary.
Exactly. So I just want to be clear. We're not saying, don't be scared of that word. It is a legit thing that we can observe, evolution happening within systems, and yet the kind we're talking about here, and it really just is more evidence to say, oh, yeah, that's pretty wild. Imagine that.
And it's Darwin's view that all things came from the same source of some single-celled amoeba that arose out of the primordial ooze. And if that's true, then there is no difference in value between a human being, an orangutan, a cockroach, and a tree.
It just really ended up being whoever had the most power and smarts.
Right. That's right. And you must then put into your theory an unbelievably large amount of time and an incredibly mathematically impossible amount of chance in order for that to even be theoretically possible. And all of the tests and evidence point in the opposite direction.
Even if that is what happened, and if there is no creator and that's what happened, then, like I said, it really just came down to who developed by chance the most smarts and the most power, and then those people should have most value. No one would say, oh, well, I'm stronger. Well, not no one. People fairly commonly agree that everyone has value, and your strength doesn't determine your real value. Obviously, we've gone through times, and different cultures do see it differently, that, oh, no, if you have power, that means you have more value. But that leads to slavery, that leads to just terrible, terrible sins and abominations that I think anyone listening to this podcast would probably agree, yeah, that's not good. And so that thought process leads us to having to be okay with that conclusion that, no, it's just whoever has the power is who is more valuable.
And that sort of brings us to the big question of, okay, what does all this matter anyway? And I would say it matters first of all, it matters because we desperately need to have a saving relationship with God. And again, I'm going from my point of view after already believing that the biblical worldview is true. If in fact it's true, we desperately need to have that saving relationship with God. If we believe he does not exist, we will be lost and hopeless. A world that does not believe in a creator is a world that destroys itself. And so,
or the creator, if they're around, destroys, like we saw with the flood.
That's right. And second, there are huge implications to this starting point question. Is there a creator? Were we created? Are we designed? There are huge implications to that question that come down to our everyday life today. Questions that affect science, philosophy, politics, day-to-day living. Like should we treat people with more respect than animals? And like, for me, the answer to that question is obvious. And that doesn't mean I hate animals. That doesn't mean I think we should torture animals. That doesn't mean anything like that. But it's astonishing to me that there are large numbers of people who now are convinced that animals are absolutely as valuable as human beings, and in many cases more so because they're not murderous and bigotry and all of that stuff. And so if we start with no creator and we all come from nothing, then there is no moral absolute. And if there is no moral absolute, then anything goes. Whoever has the most power wins. If there is no creator and we're not made in his image, then human beings are just the lucky ones who survived the survival of the fittest longest. And then anything we have to do to keep ourselves surviving should be appropriate.
Yep.
And so it has massive implications. You go, oh no, everybody agrees that you shouldn't rape and you shouldn't. Yeah, that's something called natural law. Mm-hmm. We all know these things in our heart because the law of God is imprinted on our hearts. It says in Romans that he shows us through creation and by putting it on our hearts that God exists. So we already have that in our hearts.
Yeah, and I've heard, to counter that from people, they're like, well, no, but we know that because we've learned from experience that it's not good for the whole if we do that stuff. It actually tears us down. So even though you might be sacrificing a little of your own power, it's ultimately good for you and for everybody else. So we can all kind of agree upon that. But
there's a couple problems with that.
Exactly.
And again, I'm just using logic here, right? Problem number one is even if we did all agree, and we don't, but even if we did all agree that it's what's best for the whole is what we should all do, why do we agree with that? what's our basis for that? If there is no morality, if there's no objective truth, if there's no objective good and evil, then who do we think we are to even say that whatever's good for the whole is good for everybody?
Sounds like that means that's good for you. What if I had a different opinion?
Exactly. And secondly, if we try to shove that idea into the Darwinian view of naturalism, what we come up with is something that doesn't fit, because it's all about survival of the fittest. And that shows you what people do when they discount God. They go, I need to get more power, whether that's more money, whether it's through manipulation, whether it's getting what I want, whether it's feeling better, and whoever has the most power wins. And most people that I know who don't believe in God, they hate the fact that certain people have more power than others.
Yeah.
And why do we even hate that fact? We have to ask ourselves those questions. Why is anything self-evident in terms of ethics? Why is it, as C.S. Lewis argues in Mere Christianity, why is it that if you get on a bus and you see a young teenager who's in perfectly good health forcing an old lady to get up off her seat and he takes her seat, why is it that everyone on that bus in every country in the world, in every time, in every culture, knows he did something wrong? Why is it that other than sociopaths, everyone knows that if you rape somebody, you've done a terrible thing? Everyone knows it. Doesn't matter what your religion is. Doesn't matter if you're an atheist. The truth of God is written on our hearts. And so that's what Lewis calls natural law. So we're talking about that in a philosophical sense differently than we're talking about in a biological sense, right? But our view of origin shapes our understanding of law. It shapes our understanding of ethics, of education, philosophy, all of that. In ethics, morality is subjective if there's no creator God. And we've just been talking about that. Whoever has the most power rules. But if there is a creator God, then we need to know him in order to get our lives in line with his design so we can flourish and we have a purpose that is higher than ourselves. In law, if there is no God, then as Oliver Wendell Holmes, one of the great legal minds in Western culture, was a staunch atheist. He was a big supporter of Darwin. Here's what Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote. He said that if there is no God, then laws are simply a codification of political policies designed for social engineering. That's it. Yep. Now, isn't that what we're seeing happen right now in our culture? We want to manipulate the Supreme Court so we can socially engineer things, change the laws to go the way we ought to go. When you go back and look at the imperfect document of the U.S. Constitution, it's an imperfect document written by imperfect people, some of whom were not Christian at all. But if you go back to the original document, you go, oh my goodness, there is this idea written within it that there is a law that is higher than us. So when we have the document, it is a way of saying these are the laws we already recognize as being given to us by God. We have been endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it says in the Declaration of Independence. So this idea that law without God is simply something to be manipulated by the people with the most power. And again, it comes down to power. So I would just, for the sake of time, let me summarize. Number one, cosmology, the study of the universe, has discovered that the universe clearly began to exist at a specific point in time. And anything that begins to exist must have a creator. And that creator must be intelligent, and that creator must be outside of it in order to create the universe. Second, the anthropic principle argues for design in a way that is impossible to ignore unless you have a predetermined predisposition to not follow the evidence where it leads you. But the idea of a designer that the universe, the whole universe, I'm not just talking about the earth, but the whole universe was designed in order to sustain human life. God created the universe so we could be here, and then sent his son to die on the cross so we could know him. And then third, the irreducible complexity of living things can only be explained by intelligent design. countless things had to begin in a fully formed state in order to exist at all. And there is no other way to explain that. So again, if we don't start with a predetermined outcome in mind and we follow the evidence where it goes, at least we know there must be a creator. There must be intelligent design. We can argue over whether the Bible presents an argument for who that designer and creator is and whether or not we should follow that, or whether maybe the Quran offers a better example, a better answer to that, or maybe Hinduism offers a better answer to that. That's a different discussion. Mm-hmm. But the idea that everything is just done by random chance and has no creator and there is no one with whom we have to do as moral agents is a terrible lie that has confused people and really had a massively negative impact on our culture. I love the fact that science is advancing at the rate it is because, again, we're not anti-science. We're anti-bad science. Yep. And so we want to see, where does science lead? When we follow the evidence, where does it lead us? And we have to be open-minded. And if we find out that where the evidence leads us is there's no question that what we believe about God is false, then I want to know that.
Yep.
But let's follow the evidence where it actually leads.
Got a little science-y today. So, we brought you something more. I think my entire science database goes back to the mitochondria being the powerhouse of the cell. That's like...
Congratulations, you got that right.
Yeah, that's my science general knowledge for you. But this was cool. It's cool to really unpack these things and see that we're not afraid of science. We want to embrace science and ultimately just find what truth is. And I'm going to challenge you to keep reading your word because you're going to find a lot of truth there. And the science points to it, which is really cool to see. So thank you, Pastor Doug, for answering some of these questions. We're going to keep diving into worldview stuff over these next few weeks as we continue this class that we're doing at Grace Fellowship. So,
and the whole class is available on YouTube if you want to check it out.
You could check out
in more detail.
Our YouTube channel, which is Grace Fellowship Doherty on YouTube. Or you can keep listening to these podcasts. We'll keep answering questions. But let us know if you have more questions on these topics, even if they're not specifically with that class, but they're kind of in this realm of things. We'd love to answer them and talk about them more, digest more, and learn together. So thank you for tuning in, and we will see you next week.